Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tico, and I help run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Eve Rodsky's new book, Find Your Unicorn, Reclaim Your Creative Life in a Too Busy World, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bath on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass-Whiting. We want to thank all of you for your support. With our loyal community of book lovers and authors, such as Eve and Reshma, we wouldn't be here today. We are thrilled to have Eve Rodsky with us tonight for the launch of her new book, Find Your Unicorn Space, Reclaim Your Creative Life in a Too Busy World. Eve Rodsky is a New York Times bestselling author of Fair Play, a game-changing solution for when you have too much to do and more life to live. She received her BA in Economics and Anthropology from the University of Michigan and her JD from Harvard Law School. After working in foundation management at JP Morgan, she founded the philanthropy advisory group to advise high net worth families and a charitable foundations on best practices for harmonious operations, governance, and disposition of funds. In her work with hundreds of families over a decade, she realized that her expertise in family mediation, strategy, and organizational management could be applied to a problem closer to home, a system for couples seeking balance, efficiency, and peace in their home. Eve Rodsky was born and raised by a single mom in New York City and now lives in LA with her husband and their 3 children. Joining Eve in conversation tonight is Reshma Saujani. Reshma Saujani is a leading activist and the founder of Girls Who Code, the Marshall Plan for Moms. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Pay Up. Reshma has spent more than a decade building movement to fight for women's and girls' economic empowerment, working to close the gender gap in the tech sector, and most recently, advocating for policies to support moms impacted by the pandemic. Reshma is the author of international bestseller Brave Not Perfect, and her influential TED Talk, Teach Girls Bravery, Not Perfection, has more than 5 million views globally. Reshma began her career as an attorney and democratic organizer. In 2010, she surged into the political scene as the first Indian American woman to run for US Congress. Reshma lives in New York with her husband, her sons, and their bulldog. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Eve and Reshma to the stage.
Hi, Eve.
Hi, so good to see you.
So good to see you too. And I'm so excited to talk about this book. First of all, I have to say that Eve is one of my most favorite people that I met in 2019. One of my best friends, Bianca, had been raving about you and has like, I can't wait for you both to meet. And I'm so glad I met you because we've been like sisters in solidarity, fighting the good fight for the past 2 years with women. You are so kind and so generous, and so brilliant and a fellow nerd. So I am so excited to be here with you to talk about your new book, Find Your Unicorn Space. So let's get to it. Like, why'd you write this book?
Well, it's funny because, given our activism, Reshma, I would say that, maybe return to work or fair play for business or continuing the gender division of labor themes. But I really was thinking about and haunted by the fact that when I asked people about their division of labor in the home, so many women were hesitant to even begin to think about a new division of labor in the home because so many of them said to me, I wouldn't even know what to do with my found time.
Fascinating.
And on top of that, women with more privilege were, as my friend Tova Klein says, she's a professor at Barnard in the Developing Child Center, said, a lot of people are making their children their unicorn space. The perfection of their children becomes their purpose. And I think that that's extremely dangerous. And I also think that it's extremely subversive for women to spend time on ourselves. And so unicorn space really came about, the name, because the idea of taking up space in 2010, when I started to use that term as opposed to hobby, was a very still subversive thing. The idea that women would take up space. But then I was using the term, well, white space. What white space do you have? And then I decided I didn't like that term because a lot of my friends of color said white space to them sounded like places they couldn't enter. And so I want to like retire white space. I just don't like that term. And then the idea of, okay, well, a unicorn space makes sense to me because like the mythical equine, it doesn't freaking exist until we claim the time for active pursuits that make us us. And so while friendships are important, self-care is important. What makes you come alive? Do you know what that is? And how do you claim time to be able to do it?
Mm.
Felt like an important sequel to me to this book of
Did
Fair
you feel
Play.
like, regardless of women's socioeconomic status, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, that they all kind of felt this sense of like, I don't know what to do with this newfound time, right? Like I always say in Brave Not Perfect, it's like I forgot what I loved because I was
Right.
so used to doing the things that I was good at that I didn't even have hobbies, right? Or have things.
Well, that's why I really wanted you to be at this kickoff event, especially with the Strand, which we can nerd out a little bit more. It's not, national television where I could only say this in 3 minutes. I think the nuance of your message is literally a companion to the unicorn space message, because so much of what happens to us is that we're sold this lie that we can be anything, we can do anything, right? And then I believe that. I actually really believe that. I came out at 21, rearing to go from college. I was going to be the first president and senator because, senators are lazy, right? They just legislate till like 3 o'clock and then they adjourn. So like I could issue all my executive orders at night, but I'm not going to give up my dream of being a Nick City dancer, Reshma, because I could just fly Air Force One into Madison Square Garden and do the 12:30 game and just fly back out for the state dinner that night. Like what? Like it's hard. So that ethos was who I was. And I think really what I would say to that 21-year-old was that for me, I only had 10 years left to live, that there was a clock ticking down on my potential, on my dreams. And one day I didn't have the career marriage combo I thought I was going to have. I had not fulfilled the dreams I thought I was going to have. In fact, Fair Play starts with the fact that I'd been just defined as the fulfiller of my husband's smoothie needs. And so the idea of unicorn space is when you take up space, you're also profoundly reclaiming your identity. And so I remember, again, the last thing I'll say about why this book felt important to me was as all the Fair Play stuff was happening in my household, the assumptions, the sexism, the microaggressions at work for being a woman. At the same time, I was handed Zach 13 years ago, and all of a sudden my identity was erased that week. The nurse hands me Zach and says, "Here, mom." And then I remember, cut to 3 years later when I'm having my blueberries breakdown, I'm sitting in this group of women and a couple gay men because no fathers were there. It was the primary parent group at my son's toddler transition program. And I remember the teacher looking around and saying, "These are going to be your best friends in the whole world. Look around you." And I'm sitting there with a name tag and it says Zach's mom. And I'm thinking to myself, these are going to be my best friends, the people who know me the best. They don't even know my freaking name.
Yeah.
And that was the understanding that I was wearing a mom necklace I had gotten from a friend. It had been slowly eroding my identity into my roles as a parent, partner, and or professional, till the point where all those narratives about I'd been sold at 21 were dead. They were actually dead and buried in a graveyard of unfulfilled dreams.
Yeah. The next thing I want to ask you is, and I'm so glad you in the book talk about women like Darby and what they're going through in COVID and in this pandemic. And I'm sure you've heard this more than, before when you started working on this book, before the pandemic, is I'm a mom. I just don't have time to be creative. Like I always say, I don't have time to have a midlife crisis, much less be creative. Like, what do you say to that?
Well, I think,
Especially now.
yes,
Is it
yes.
different?
What I say to that is, it's very in line with what the research has showed me now since 2010 on women's economic security, our power, our place in society, because it's not that we don't have time for it. We've just been conditioned not to use our time on ourselves, right? Because that's actually a very subversive thing to a capitalist patriarchy for women to have ideas. And so when you think about the history of women not having ideas, We were burned as witches when we had ideas. We were choked to death in corsets so that we wouldn't have ideas. We have to spend lots of time making ourselves really small and starve ourselves. And when you're starving, it's hard to have space for ideas. We're told things like breastfeeding is free when it's really 1,800 hours of our time. So what happens is that time becomes the most valuable currency in a capitalist patriarchy, and women are taught to give it away for free. And so what I will say is that you absolutely have time. And I'm not just talking about the most privileged of us. In fact, in my research, the people who identified in the 9.9% of this country were the ones telling me they had the hardest time with finding their unicorn space. Because what I think how to unpack that is the bigger our extrinsic milestones get, the smaller we become to shrink in them. And so what I will say is that if you give your time for free to everybody else, because society has taught you that your time is not valuable, it's sand, and we guard men's time as if it's, diamonds, then of course you won't have time.
Yeah.
So this is more a cultural revolution than it is a productivity book. This is an idea that it's subversive. These are triggering messages. People are not always receiving them so easily because these are hard messages.
Yeah. It's funny as you're talking, my son is obsessed with green. And so I bought him this like green jacket and I realized like, oh shoot, like I don't have winter boots. And so of course he was like, I want green winter boots. Well, let me tell you, Eve, there are like no green winter boots on Amazon that are not available before like March 15th. But I kid you not, yesterday, like in between my mammogram, in between my CT scan, in between my 10 talks, like I'm frantically searching for green boots. And why I could not at some point be like, screw it, like you're getting gray boots or blue boots or red boots or whatever. But it goes back to this like perfectionist mom tendency that I want my kids to feel happy. And that kind of pursuit of doing things perfect takes a lot of time away from you. And I think separate, and I especially in this pandemic right now, right? You feel guilty being creative. You feel guilty having time for yourself. And I think it goes to my next point is like, why? Because I don't feel like men feel this way.
They don't.
Right. And you have this line in your book where I think you're talking about, this couple, and he's like, I'm playing the guitar. Like I had the most time ever, right? In this pandemic's been great. Like I lost 20 pounds and I'm like now know how to play the guitar and I feel I've slept 12 hours a day, right? Like completely different experience. Why do women have such a hard time and why is it so important to change that for women?
Well, again, why I think our messages are so compatible is because the girls who code, I don't want them to turn into a graveyard of unfulfilled dreams when they're kicked out for a sexist workplace and they are not paid equally because there's a bias against mothers, right? The only way to really solve these issues is to understand that a fulfilled creative life is one that is afforded to all of us. And why is it that we have such a hard time? Well, I think that's what unicorn space became, because what was happening to me on all these panels, I'm sitting with all the productivity experts where my pale and male colleagues would say, well, you just need 2 uninterrupted days a week. And I'm like, that's your solution? Women on average in the pandemic, according to one Washington Post Time survey, were being interrupted every 3 minutes and 42 seconds. That was the longest stretch we were getting without any active interruptions. So how can I tell you and just launch into a plan for creativity without addressing the 3 things that women, men, and non-binary individuals, but I'd say this is mostly a women's issue, around what were their hurdles? What are their hurdles to active pursuits that make them come alive? And in order of survey, number 1 was, and I'd say that's number 1 by survey says by probably 2/3, and there were two more, but the number 1 was the idea that I don't have a permission to be unavailable for my roles. And whether it's internal permission, that voice that you talk about in Brave Not Perfect, or societal permission, because I remember even when I was writing Fair Play, my first unicorn space, when I was really curious about why the gender division of labor was happening to me, I remember even when I was able to negotiate with Seth with my little voice then. I didn't have the same big voice that I have now because I was too subject of that guilt. And I said, can I have an hour off on Sundays? And once I even got that hour to write and to research, I remember not only having guilt and shame, which was the number 2 reason, permission to be unavailable, guilt and shame, and then asking for what you need came in as a strong third. But I remember everybody around me was shaming me. People were saying to me, you're not going to spend time as a family on Sundays. One acquaintance even said to me, well, I think Seth's going to leave you because you don't see him during the week. And now you don't even spend time with him on the weekends. It was these very odd, strange messages. And yes, it's a decade ago. By now, maybe things are a little better because we have people like you, the leaders I invest in. But it was a hard time to carve out that time for myself. It is not easy to say, I want uninterrupted attention for things I love.
Yeah.
And you can't even wear your own initial. I mean, part of my process of getting back to myself, this is a unicorn, but part of the process of getting back to myself was taking off that mom necklace my friend gave me that first week in the hospital and putting an E back on my neck and saying to my kids, you know what? I love you, but you get hats that say Zach on them. You have shirts that have your jersey, Rodsky in the back. I want my name back. And so the symbolism of reclaiming my initial, having my kids understand my name is Eve. And actually it was Eve Madison. And I probably regret the fact that it's Rodsky. I didn't ever think about changing my name. I just did it. All these things are now in our dialogue in our household.
But, and why is it so important, right? For us to reclaim it? What does that mean for ourselves or the world? Why does it matter? What is like you taking Eve back?
I think the stakes are that high. And the stakes are that high because otherwise you risk losing not only yourself, but the every indicator and link to longevity, to mental health, to your physical health, the things we say we're protecting right now are linked to these active pursuits. They're in research, we'll nerd out a little. It's called eudaimonic well-being. So what I got to do, and this is fun, I'll dig in a little bit deeper with you because you're also an academic at heart, is I sat in a lot of the happiness labs. There's one at UCLA in the business school. Laurie Santos runs one. I took her Coursera. I was really trying to understand positive psychology because positive psychology is also interesting because the right wing has co-opted positive psychology to say, well, if your happiness ratio doesn't really change, then what do we need to give you benefits for if you're not going to be happier because you have a better social safety net, right? There's a lot of bizarre things that are happening in positive psychology. So I wanted to understand it for myself. And here's the spoiler alert. What I found out is that when you wish happiness on someone or want it for yourself, it actually makes you more sad. I even got Professor Laurie Santos to admit that. And she writes, she has a whole course and podcast on happiness. Because the truth is, when we say to our kids, I want you to be happy, or when we say that for ourselves, it's not where happiness should live as the be all end all, because you're asking me what the stakes are. The stakes are that every one of us have a right to live a life of the intersection of happiness and meaning. That was the sweet spot. And so what I mean by that is I started to look into studies about what is happiness without meaning. That's what we call hedonistic well-being. We see addiction rates up all over. A lot of people are turning to hedonistic ways of coping because that's all we know. So that's happiness without meaning. If you think
leads to sadness is what you're saying.
Right. Well, yes, which leads to bad outcomes. If you think about meaning without happiness, that's how most caregivers live. And that is, I have a ton of meeting taking care of my kids. I never feel happy taking care of them, ever. And this data shows it. But the intersection of your mental health is where meaning meets happiness. And those are in these flow state pursuits, these active pursuits. I have a woman in the book who is a social worker, and she opened her feminist bookstore, burst of happiness and meaning. A stay-at-home mom who at 56 said, nobody knows my name. I'm defined by my roles. I'm an object at rest. I'm going to race cars. I want to be an object in motion. At 67, she's now one of the top rally car racers in the world. She's in Antarctica right now, racing across the continent. These women understand the stakes are that high, and basically they report that they are living again. So I always say, well, what's the opposite of that? What's the opposite of saying I'm living again? I'm breathing again. I don't want to live in whatever the opposite of that is.
Right. So connect the unicorn space to meaning.
So so I can do that. That's a great question. So that's the second part of the book. So we just sort of did the sad part, which is the graveyard of unfulfilled dreams and what, my 10 years left to live. The fun part was actually digging into the data of the 750 interviews. So I had 500 from Fair Play with the same questions as an additional 150 as an additional 100 on social media. And the beauty of those interviews was that there was a secret formula that connected happiness with meaning. And that secret formula was curiosity plus connection plus completion. So back to where happiness sits. I will ask you one thing you can do starting today is ask yourself and your kids, instead of saying, I want you to be happy or I'm looking for happiness, you say, I'm looking for a curiosity. It is a better way to live your life because it's not passion. It's not static. I want to burn the word passion, burn the word hobby, and bring out this idea that when you have a values-based curiosity, and I don't mean, as my friend said, you mean I can have unicorn space by scrolling my friend's Venmo transactions? No, not that type of curiosity, but a values-based curiosity. I care about justice, but I wonder why there's not justice in my household, right? That was the beginning of Fair Play for me. Then you start to share yourself with the world, right? I find a Reshma and I say, and you did this for me. I'm going to write a book about this. What do I do? How do I do this? You start to share your intention with the world, to crystallize it, to help you get over your fear, to be brave and not perfect. And then the one that most aligns with your and my work was the third C that was most triggering for me, but it kept coming up over and over again for people who said they were self-actualized in meaning and happiness. And that was completion. It was exactly your message, this idea that they were brave, they faced their fear, they completed something, and they recognized that it didn't have to be perfect. And sometimes that means a screenplay just went out to their writing group. It never got sold, but they were happy with that outcome because it was something that could never be taken away from them. So if you think about the intersection of happiness and meaning, it was this secret formula of the trifecta of having curiosity plus connection and sharing with others, plus completions along the way. So they weren't stuck in feeling like they had unfulfilled dreams.
So how did you develop this framework? Like you do all these interviews, right? And you see these common themes. Walk us through how this.
Exactly. Yes. So it's qualitative. And I shout out to my mother for her PhD in sociology and Pam Stone as both of my advisors. So I'm not an academic. There's not a peer-reviewed study, but it's based on the sociology framework of qualitative research. And so the way you do qualitative research, or the way I did it, was when you start seeing themes emerge, you ask the same set of questions. And when themes emerge, the next set of interviewees takes on those themes plus the original questions, and then plus the original questions and plus the original questions. And so then you end up looking at your data and saying, wow, my most common annotation was CIYOO for Fair Play. That was complicit in your own oppression. So that's how I knew I had to write to women. For unicorn space, the number one word that kept coming up was drowning. And then when I unpacked that word to give me more adjectives to understand what that meant, the combination of overwhelmed and bored was what was coming up by what that definition was. And I kept thinking, oh my God, these are amazing women, beautiful, amazing women with ideas. And so my idea was thinking, how is it that we are living a life where we have now convinced women to stick through it, to just power through it, to be overwhelmed and bored? And that's the dirty little secret, is that our whole society runs on that.
Yeah, we depend on us to be overwhelmed.
Right,
and bored.
we have to be overwhelmed and bored, because we can't run for office that way. We're doing all the unpaid labor of society. It's literally built on our backs. And we have no economic security. We see no women in C-suites, statistically on average. So it's done really well for people in power to keep us overwhelmed and bored. So I honestly felt that this is more than a creativity message. This to me felt so subversive, like it was a political
It was a
movement.
way to keep us under.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
So you're raised by a single mom. You go to Harvard, right? Working class. You marry Seth. Here you are, Harvard educated, and you find yourself at home raising your kids. Two different experiences. You're raised one way, and then you're a wife one way, or a mom one way. How did those two narratives lead you to write Unicorn Space?
Such a great question. You're a great interviewer. You can also, another skill, unicorn space to yours is you need an MSNBC show. I'm going to put that intention out for you right now. They're a very important intersection, I think, because of the shame. You were talking earlier about guilt and shame. So I have I had a lot of guilt about carving out the time to write Fair Play. Less now, of course, with Unicorn Space because I'd worked through Fair Play. But let's talk about shame for a minute. I think my shame came from the fact that this shouldn't have happened to me because I prided myself. Psychologists would call me a parental child. And if my mother's on here, she knows I helped her with her late utility bills. We had lots of eviction notices in Stuyvesant Town. Money would fly out all over the grocery store. I'd be like, oh, that's my mother's. I'm going to go pick it up. She lost her license in my car yesterday. So I dress her. So I've always been a very parental child. I explained that my brother couldn't read and he had a learning disability. He had to go to a different school. He's being beat up, presenting that to my parents. So living as a parental child, I felt very early in my soul that I was going to have an equal partnership. That felt like a value to me that I would never give up. And then on top of it, my specialty is my day job is I work for HBO shows Succession type clients. I have 4 left. I don't have that many left, but I kept 4 because I still love the work. And I'm trained in difficult conversations. So I think the shame for me was thinking I decided to have a life where I was going to stay that president and senator and Nick City dancer have an equal partnership. And I know how to communicate perfectly, duh, because I'm a Harvard trained mediator. And still I found myself drowning, like all those other women said, under this perfectionist parenting, patriarchal messaging, being shocked and surprised by how hard it was to raise a kid and try to have any semblance of a career, basically leaving my career to be the fulfiller of my husband's smoothie needs. And it was so much shame that was wrapped up to me in my identity loss because I had worked so hard, Reshma, to protect it.
And to get there.
And to
Against
get
the
there.
odds.
Yeah. It was really, really hard. And that's it. My brother didn't make it. I mean, I love him. He's, lots of learning disabilities. He lives at home. We work hard on him, but I also think that compared to him, I feel like I had the privilege to make it. And so, and the fact that I felt like I was squandering it, was my shame. But again, because I was blaming myself. That's the whole point. I couldn't do it. That's how I thought. I couldn't do it. And that is so sad because I want no woman to ever think that again. I couldn't do it. We are set up to not do it.
So what took you from that moment where you're laying there on the floor and you're like, I can't do this? What brought you back? What made you Eve Rodsky, Fair Play, Unicorn Space, leader of women, and elevating the conversation? Like, how did you go from that to that? How'd you pick yourself up?
It's a great question. And again, I am one of my own subjects, because for me, it really was small curiosities. It was thinking to myself, I remember having this aha moment, Reshma, when my friend said to me, well, I can solve your division of labor in 3 words. And I was like, oh my God, please tell me. And she's like, it's called court ordered custody. I was like, oh, okay. Well, my mom did that and it didn't work out that well for us. Like, I still sort of like Seth. Right. So it was this idea that, is there a different way? Is there a marriage, is there a divorce for married people? Is there a place? Because what was happening, which became, again, why unicorn space felt so important to me, was, as you said earlier, Professor John Jasimowitz at Harvard Business Review talks about compartmentalization. Men compartmentalize. When they're surfers, they're surfers. You add Darby Saxby's research in that shows that men get almost twice as much leisure time as women. Then you have a surfer with twice as much time as we do. Whereas we bring our roles as mother, partner, parent, professional, green boots getter with us everywhere we go. So we don't have as much compartmentalizing, as much unencumbered mind as Virginia Woolf would say.
Yeah.
So to me, it was the way back to myself was understanding the curiosity of why.
Yeah.
Why is it that half the population doesn't have guilt and shame? Why is it that half the population can compartmentalize? Why is it that it can't? And then my first curiosity question was, I'll just say, Dr. Pat Levitt changed my life because I sat in his office. He's a top neurologist. He started something called the Harvard Center for the Developing Mind. And I said to him, I'm curious, are women better multitaskers? Are we wired differently to see the missing sock in the dryer, And he looked at me and he said, culturally or neurologically? And I said, well, duh, I'm here for you neurologically. And he said, no, there's no difference in gender difference in multitasking. He said, but imagine, Eve, men could convince you women that you're better at wiping asses and doing dishes. How great for my leisure time, my unicorn space, my career. That was the day that I said, I'm not going to live like this anymore.
Yeah. And and I think I hope everyone who's listening is listening to what you're saying, because it's so powerful. And it's how I started Girls Who Code and Marshall Plan for Moms is this curiosity, for Girls Who Code. It was like, why are girls not going into STEM? Like, this is weird. Like, why, what's going on there? Like, and same with Marshall Plan for Moms. Like, why did everyone just assume that moms were going to Zoom school their kids? Like, what is that about? And I often think what you're saying is so important because we sometimes as women don't question the things that are happening to us. So we don't tap into our own curiosity because we assume that that's the way that it is. And I think this idea of questioning the things that happen to you and the women around you and your daughters and is the way to social entrepreneurship and to movement change. And I think that that's so powerful.
I wonder.
Build that.
The ability to wonder, because my mother is a professor of social change, and I will shout out to her, right? This idea that she really believes the path to social change is, pre-consciousness to consciousness, and you have to fight for those solutions. And, fortune doesn't favor the brave. I mean, it's hard to be brave, does not favor us. It is hard because the status quo is meant to favor other people. And so to fight against these cultural messages is, as we said earlier, it is not for the faint of heart. My friend called me this morning and she was crying. And I said, are you okay? She's in Colorado. And she said, well, I've been listening to your audiobook, Unicorn Space. She was somebody who was an early Should I Do helper in Fair Play. So she knows my work well. And she said, I think I can't get to your program. I'm going to have to pause before I get to the 3C framework because I need to spend some time grieving the loss of 10 years of creativity. What could I have done in that time that I was just too overwhelmed to do? I need to grieve that loss. That's okay. For me, the way I grieved my loss was I had to put guilt and shame, and I write about this in the book, on an origami piece of paper. I always thought it was funny. People would send Anna these strange gifts, like, what 2-year-old's doing origami, but whatever. So I took her paper, I co-opted it. And I remember going on my first book tour, writing guilt and shame on an origami piece of paper and folding up so small, Reshma. And I remember lighting it on fire. And I just talked to guilt and shame. I said, you know what? Without guilt, I probably wouldn't have done my homework and studied so hard for my SATs and all the things I needed to do to get out of Stuyvesant Town. But I don't need you anymore.
Yeah. I want to get to this because it's hitting on what you're saying. And I think one of the questions I want to ask you, but I'm cheating. I'm going to the questions a little bit early just because this one is, I think for a lot of people who are listening are probably feeling this, especially right now with what's happening with the schools and Omicron is, this conversation, it hits differently for me right now, she says. The word drowning is particularly fitting for me at this moment in the pandemic. I'm working from home full time. My son's school is closed, so he's home. And my husband is back in the office. So most of the household duties are falling back on me. How can I find my unicorn space at this moment when I feel so overwhelmed?
Well, first of all, we see you. So I think that part of Reshma and my work is to see you and to say this is not okay. A lot of what we do are fighting for those social safety nets so that we are the ghost of Christmas future. It should end with us. So I want to say we see you. And what I would say about where you are in this moment is that sometimes it's really okay just to sit with these concepts. Doesn't mean you have to implement an entire unicorn space plan right now. It took me 10 years to write Fair Play, or till now. It's been a long, long journey. Sometimes just sitting in the fact that your time is diamonds and you deserve that permission to be unavailable, that self-talk is where I would start. Understanding when you're searching for the green boots or when you're voluntarily taking on all the cards, I wonder, why is that happening to me? Is it because your partner makes more money than you, so you've been conditioned to think that their time is more valuable? Is it because you say to yourself, you're a better multitasker? Is it because you've been conditioned to say in the time it takes me to tell him, her, they what to do, I should do it myself? Is it because we say to ourselves, yeah, my partner is better at focusing on one task at a time and I can find the time? All of these are toxic time messages that have been fed to us since birth. So I think what I would say is you can just live in the fact that we see you, but understand that you cannot live like, I will not let you live like this forever. That curiosity, the number one thing I will say that people are doing that I find so fun is this new movement from the part of the book around the motivation to share. People are starting with, well, why would I want to share my unicorn space with others? Is it because I want to pass down, my Hindu heritage? One of my friends is doing Hindu astrology to my daughter and my son. Is it because I need an accountability partner? I want to write a novel. I need Reshma to sit with me in a writing class. So start thinking about the people you can bring along with you on these small journeys right now, because it's much easier when you can do it with somebody else. And I think I just want to keep saying that we are been conditioned in every way, and it's small, it's toxic. I'm pulling up this thing because I'm laughing because I took a picture of this from this. I don't read Us Weekly anymore because of the highly toxic sexist messaging. But I was on an airplane. My friend said, "Do you want to read this?" I was like, "Fine." So I'm looking at, this is about Olivia Munn and John Mulaney. I don't even know who that is. John goes back on tour in March and he'll try to be with Olivia and the baby as much as he can. And then the next paragraph says, neither of them had a baby before, but they're learning quick. Everything from feeding and napping times and changing diapers, says the source. John has surprisingly been very hands-on and he's helping out. That's what we're up against.
Yeah.
A narrative that having it all means doing it all. So I see you. And I would say, bring a spiritual friend along with you and start just getting curious about yourself again. That's all. Just get curious.
And I think also it's like, I mean, you talk about this, we both talk about this idea of like, I don't know the specifics, but I know that when this is happening in my household, like we both can work from home, but my husband's out the door, right? Because he's not dealing with the homeschooling that's happening now, and I'm balancing all of it. And I feel guilty when I'm like, no, I'm out today. You're staying at home, because I feel like society is telling women that this is your job to do. And so I think every way that we think about design, like there's only so much of this we can potentially shift, but every way that we think about design in terms of working from home, in terms of flexibility, in terms of school hours, in terms of like this fight we're having about virtual schooling in this moment, all of it needs to acknowledge that we sit in a world where 86% of the domestic labor is done by women.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we change that? In this, I love what you're saying about creative space. It's because we have to demand time for ourselves, not to do more work, but to have more time to just breathe.
Yes, and that's why hobby, passion project, vanity project, there's all these sexist terms for when women try to have ideas. And I remember when my mother, she had the hardest time, I'd say, probably getting unicorn space, because she was from a Sephardic Jewish family that had wanted her to marry an older man. She ended up marrying my father, who left her when she was pregnant with my brother. And they were like, I told you so. And they left her with no money, no resources, 2 kids on the step of a rent stabilized apartment on Avenue C and 14th Street. And she's like, I'm not going to give up my dream. And I remember as a kid, I was like, this is selfish. And my mom is not home to put us to bed. And I'm a latchkey kid. But honestly, Reshma, I look back at the biggest gift my mother ever did for me was to say, you know what? I may be okay doing it all, or I have to do it all because I'm a single mother, but I'm not okay with my kids watching me do it all. And so even if that means they have to do it themselves,
Yeah.
or they're going to be latchkey kids, or they're going to take on cards and labor because she didn't have a partner, that role modeling was very important. And I will say that I do want to acknowledge, of course, that, there is a very subversive and important movement now that is starting by women of color to understand that rest is subversive. It is subversive, and claiming rest. And this is an ancillary message to say, once you have your rest, you have some space to think about your values, who you are. And the most important thing I think that has been the hardest for women is they say to me, I don't know what my motivations are anymore. We're making decisions from places that are not intrinsically motivating.
Yeah.
Because society told us to do this, or they're the gendered assumptions, or because we think we need a bigger apartment because our friend does. It is very, very, very subversive and liberating to start having intrinsically motivated decision making.
Yeah. I'm just loving your mom in the chat, which she just said, thanks, Eve. I have never heard that. Eve's mom, Terry. This is like my dad. My dad joins every talk that I
I
do.
love it.
And
Thanks,
he's like,
Mom. I knew you were there.
it's very sweet. So
Oh.
that's amazing. But that's, it's really, look, 56% of children today are raised by single mothers. And I do think that we leave them out and their struggles in this conversation, and that like reclaiming their creative space and allowing them to have that by saying, and you give me resiliency, right? By making me figure it out. That's actually a good thing. I think is a really powerful,
It's powerful. And we're not, again, I think what's happened that's been so strange in this time is that, and it happens in every time, we keep thinking women are going to be liberated by new things. We thought women would be liberated by birth control. Then we thought women would be liberated by IVF. We keep giving ourselves tools to liberate ourselves. And then what happens is society makes it even harder because they move the benchmarks.
Yep.
We liberate ourselves. We had washing machines. They're like, well, that's going to liberate women in housework. No, because then Pinterest perfect parenting means you have to tie-dye your kids' shit for tie-dye day, right? All of a sudden things started getting harder. You have silly hat day at school, and and you're still supposed to pick up at 3, and guilt and shame to look and be like all these women that you see in these social media platforms that somehow have 4 kids, weigh 98 pounds, and are at a bar a week later. I don't know who these people are. But the goalpost keeps moving for us.
Yeah.
If we're not intrinsically motivated. And that's where guilt and shame comes in. I want to be very clear about guilt and shame. If your kids are not dead, you are a good mother. You are a good mother. And honestly, I will say that being interested in your own life, that is the biggest gift you can give to your children.
So Veronique's asking this. I always have this form of guilt when I find time for myself. Any advice on ways to subside or suppress the guilt?
Okay, so let's talk practically about guilt. Besides burning it, you can try that burning ritual, because I actually think it really works. And I often go back to it. Sometimes I'll just strike a match. I always keep a lighter with me to think about the fire. Or I've been lighting a lot of candles lately. It's been sort of my New Year's resolution, or not a resolution, but a practice to light candles. But I think Cheryl Gonzalez Ziegler is a mentor of mine. I worked with a lot of psychologists on fair play and unicorn space to make sure that back to design thinking. Reshma, I think about us a lot because there's this whole new book world of designing your life, design thinking, right? It came out of sort of Stanford's art program. And there are a lot of men. So the funny thing about design, if you really think about design, and I'm obsessed with design. That's what Fair Play is, a system. Unicorn Space is a system. It's a program. Is that really the only people who actually design things in this country are lawyers? You want people to stop at a stop sign? Guess what you're going to do? You're going to pass a law. You don't want people to vote in Georgia? Guess what you're going to do? You're going to pass a law. So lawyers, we are design thinkers
Right.
from the day we set foot on the law school campus. So if you think about design, I think the most important thing you can think about is when you is designing your own life, right? The idea that we can, within the constraints of everybody else, we can start to design our own life. And it starts with, as you said, recognizing, wondering, being curious about why things are happening. Why do I feel so much guilt and shame? Why do I feel domestic encroachment? That used to happen to me. I'd carve out an hour to write, and my heart would start pounding, and I'd say, I might as well pick up Ben because I'm a terrible mother. All that self-talk. So instead of, and Hitha talks about this, Hitha Palapu, we both know Hitha. She says, instead of letting the self-talk come to you, start speaking to yourself. And I love that. So when you speak to yourself, this is what I'd like you to say. I feel guilty because, immediately replace it with I made the decision because. It is so much more powerful. So when I say to myself, I feel guilty because I'm not putting Anna to bed, I now say I made the decision not to put Anna to bed because I'm promoting my book that I think is important to Germany and to other places where the time zone means I need to talk to them at nights, their morning. And I communicate that with much more power to my children. And so that is one reframe that I think we all can do starting today, is start to understand our decision making. You're making active decisions. You can take agency in your own life. Even though we're breathing polluted air, we still have to breathe. And you can start by saying, anytime you feel that guilt, you recognize it, you can hear it, let it process, and then just wonder what it feels like to say, I feel guilty because, and start replacing it with, I'm making that decision because. I've been doing that for about a year, and it's been a very, very powerful tool for me.
I'm going to try that. So we have a lot of questions on like tactical questions, right? About, I don't know where to begin. How do I develop my creative pursuits? You know, so, Ariana says, you know, another says, you know, have you found any books that have helped supplement unicorn spaces? So what's your,
Well, one thing I'd love to do, if anybody, I don't know how, I couldn't do this with privacy to offer it in advance, but if you're interested, every Fair Play book comes with a card game, because how could it not, right? So Fair Play came with, you know, the 100 cards. That's just one little fifth of them. But what was really fun for me was, for people who need to get inspired, I've been playing with these cards.
Did you make unicorn space cards?
Yes, they're unicorn space cards. So if anybody wants them, you can DM me at Eve Rodsky and I will get you. These are just prototypes because we're going to actually make them. But what's really fun is to start thinking about, let's play a game. We have a couple minutes. I'm going to read you 10 cards, and there's lots of ways to play, but we'll just play for fun by looking at some of them. I want you to tell me a card that resonates with you. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a card to your hand, like Cards Against Humanity, that I think would enhance and remix your card. Okay, so I'm going to give you, we're pretending like you drew a hand. So I'm going to say 10 cards. You pick the one that resonates the most with you.
Okay.
Research and learning, or health and wellness, storytelling, oral, written, or performance, math and sciences, florals, pottery, arrows and axes, building and DIY, or genealogy and lineage.
Storytelling.
Storytelling. Oh my God, I love that someone just said. So I play along with us.
Yes, everyone can drop it into the chat.
Okay, so I think I'm gonna add genealogy and lineage.
Are you going to tell me that that's what you want to be your unicorn space?
No, I'm adding that to your card. So I'll tell you how I'm going to pitch to you. So the way you play is like a Shark Tank. So every one of your friends would pitch you a combination of yours. So I'm going to pitch to you that I think storytelling and genealogy and lineage would be really interesting, because I think it would be so fun to do a Girls Who Code program where these the girls get to look back at their lineage and their genealogy and see if they had anybody in their genealogy that was somebody who was interested or working within the sciences. And if not, if they could tell a story of one of their ancestors that may had an unfulfilled dream that they can now help that person fulfill.
I love
That
it.
would be my pitch to you.
I love that. Well, and it's funny because
somebody else may take another one, right? So the point is, like, I think these are really fun. There's lots of ways to get inspired, but I would say the practical ways, I'm happy to send you this deck if you want to start playing.
Send it to me. I want to play. You know, it's interesting. It's one of the, you made me, as you talked about genealogy, there's one, you know, one of the questions in here is like this idea of like how the mental toll is passed through generations. And, you know, what have you seen in your research? Like, did you feel like, just with you and your mom, I think about me and my mother, you know, my mother was refugees, you know, and so in many ways, I have more privilege to take on more mental toll than she did because they were working all the time and they didn't have time, you know, to figure out where the froggy was or to pack the diaper bag or to make sure that I had the green boots or like the perfect birthday cake. What are you seeing us go backwards?
Such a great question. I would say that unfulfilled dreams, there is back to why I wanted to pitch the genealogy plus your storytelling for Girls Who Code, is there, most women I know have a woman in their life that they have an unfulfilled dream story about. It was one of my questions, not exactly as far back as I would have liked, because this graveyard of unfulfilled dreams came up later. And I love that term. And that was a friend who coined it. And so I started to ask about this graveyard of unfulfilled dreams. Are there people in your past? And so I can tell you the story of my grandmother, second born, really ended up being abusive and sad, mentally ill, to her daughters, because I believe she was someone who should have been something great. So smart, born it, you know, decided to marry a Syrian Jewish man with the, you know, that immigrant community was very much like women don't work. They're not educated. You speak when you're spoken to. She was being boxed in. And so her life was really one that was supposed to be civic engagement. She was obsessed with the Kennedys. She taught my mother a lot, but I think she could have been a lot more. So yes, I think if you think about it, probably all of us have some story of a woman in our lives that had an unfulfilled dream. And I think that generational trauma is put on us because those people who didn't have their dreams fulfilled either shame us if our dreams are fulfilled or put too much pressure on us to be their dreams.
Right.
And so that's why the intrinsic motivation is so important, because there is going to be, if you have a family like that, if any of us, or, you know, a lot of immigrant families, we have this, the pressure to succeed for me was so big because I was a Jewish family. You know, we were like, again, we were working class. I was going to be different. I was going to, you know, be that person who buys my mother a home. And so, you know, how do I have my own dreams if getting A's was really all that was expected of me?
So beautiful. I'm going to leave it on that. That was wonderful. I could talk to you all day long. We've had so much incredible engagement in the chat. And so I hope everybody reads this, gives it to a friend, buys it for another woman, does a unicorn space, you know, group where people commit and become accountability partners with one another to not let their dreams die on the vine. So thank you so much. Eve, did you want to say anything to close?
I just want to say that part of your unicorn space I'm so excited about is your next book. And so sharing with the world will come out in March, but if you could share it with the world early, I think that would be so fun. And then anybody else who has unicorn space they want to share with us, we love sharing your unicorn space on social media. Please, please share with us. I got some beautiful oil paintings this morning on socials. I got a woman who was axe throwing. I love, it makes me literally like burst with happiness. So can you tell us a little bit about what's coming up for you?
Well, my book Pay Up is out on March 15th, and it's really about how do we finally make workplaces work for moms, you know, and for women. It's like for so long, I mean, the big reveal that I had, Eve, in this pandemic was, you know, I spent most of my life as the founder of Girls Who Code telling girls to grab that quarter office, that if you got a mentor, if you got a sponsor, if you leaned in, like I bought into that big lie. And then COVID revealed for me what we always knew was that if you don't have gender equality at home, you're never going to have equality in the workplace. And today we sit The United States, the only nation that doesn't offer paid leave. So many of us can't afford our childcare. We still have the motherhood penalty. In the middle of Omicron and schools closing, our employers are telling us to come back to work. Like, workplaces are broken. And we've had millions of women leave the workforce, and we have lost 40 years of equality in 9 months. And so, we need a movement to change that. And so that's what this book is about.
Well, I've already pre-ordered. Everyone needs to pre-order. Pay Up is my Bible for what we're doing in our policy. And I can't wait to continue to collaborate with you, Reshma. And thank you for your time as diamond. So I appreciate you being here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eve.
Thank you, Strand.
Thank you, everyone, for attending the event. If you haven't purchased a copy of the book, the link is in the chat, along with, if you want to pre-order Reshma's book, the link is also in the chat, along with Eve and Reshma's socials. Thank you so much for everyone, and have a good night.
Bye, everyone.